The International Olympic Committee under fire. Many are accusing it of not taking decisive action against Russia for its alleged state-sponsored doping program. So what's behind the IOC's decision? Was politics involved? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The Summer Olympics in Rio de Janeiro are just a few weeks away, but hundreds of Russian athletes still don't know whether they'll be competing. The International Olympic Committee was expected to impose a blanket ban on Russia after allegations of widespread state-sponsored doping. But instead, the organization announced on Sunday that Russian athletes will be individually drug tested and scrutinized. That's before they can be cleared for competition. The IOC president, Thomas Bach, says the plan is ambitious but necessary.
Every human being is entitled to individual justice. There we have set the bar to the absolute limit for how Russian athletes can achieve to compete in Rio. All of them have to meet individually these number of very strict criteria we have established today.
Well, Russia has praised and welcomed that decision by the IOC, but it has upset many sports officials, especially those from the World Anti-Doping Agency who strongly supported banning Russia from the Olympics. WADA released a report last year saying sports in Russia is corrupt from the top level down. Authorities are accused of swapping tainted urine to help athletes cheat drugs tests. And members of Russia's Federal Security Service allegedly threatened drug testers. The agency's president says WADA is disappointed that the IOC did not heed WADA's executive committee recommendations that would have ensured a straightforward, strong and harmonized approach. The McLaren report exposed beyond a reasonable doubt a state-run doping program in Russia that seriously undermines the principles of clean sport embodied within the World Anti-Doping Code. Now, the Australian sports minister, Susan Ley, also criticizing the decision.
Well, I've reflected on the IOC decision by expressing my strong disappointment. Clearly, it's going to be very difficult for the international federations in the 12 days before Rio to go through what they need to rule in or out athletes in terms of resources and in terms of time.
Now, athletes from around the world have spoken out against the IOC's decision not to ban Russia from Rio. Lauren Williams, an American runner and Olympic gold medalist, says it speaks to the conflict of interest that the IOC has and their inability to really stand up and be a leader for athletes and clean sport, to really be on our side. This just furthers the point that this is a business. It's not something really built and set in the best interests of athletes. Let's now bring in our guests to this discussion. In Moscow, Vladimir Mikheev. He's an independent analyst with the Troika Report project. And Toronto, joining us via Skype, is Aurel Braun. He's a professor for international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Welcome to Inside Story. Vladimir, so just a few of the words that have been described about this decision of the IOC deciding against a complete ban on Russian athletes. Some of the words, it's a cop-out, the IOC is spineless. Why do you think this decision was made by the IOC?
Well, my personal opinion is the decision by the executive board of the International Olympic Committee is somewhat dubious, and I'm afraid it actually sets a rather dangerous precedent. I think that basically what the decision amounts to is that the IOC has shifted their responsibility towards the international federations. Now it will be for the international federations to decide whether they will accept or ban Russian athletes.
Aurel, is this decision justified in your opinion?
It is hardly an ideal decision. I think the evidence was overwhelming that there could have been a ban, a complete ban. But on the other hand, when we examine it closely, this is hardly a victory for Russia. We have to look at what actually was said. The decision that was made was indeed to kind of punt to the federations, but they declared, the IOC, that all Russian athletes were viewed as tainted, that the onus of proof was on the athletes to go to the individual federations and show that they were drug-free, and only then could they participate. And even if that participation was allowed, there would be a final review by the IOC.
But here's the thing, how is that going to work exactly? Because it's only a couple of weeks before the Olympic Games, and how is it that the federations will actually be able to vet all the Russian athletes on time?
It's going to be very difficult. In the case of one federation, the tennis association, they seem to have just gone through a kind of pro forma process, not a very credible ones, but I think other federations would be much more thorough, which will mean that lots of Russian athletes will not be able to participate. So if we look at Russian actions, not as just sport, but really, to use Clausewitz's phrase, to paraphrase it, the Putin government has looked on sports as a continuation of politics. And as such, this is a massive blow to the prestige of the Putin government. This is the government that has spent more on the Sochi Olympics than any other country in history. This was a case of sports very clearly being used to try to legitimate the government, a kind of use of circuses to divert popular attention from various problems inside Russia. So this is a massive loss of prestige. This is the Putin government trying to make the best of a really bad situation.
Vladimir, is that a point of view that you agree with from Moscow, that this is a massive blow to Putin's government in Russia?
Well, I actually can't see that there is enough evidence to prove the assertion, this kind of assertion, for the mere reason that the executive board of the IOC has taken as accepted the report made by the president of the Russian Olympic Committee, saying that in the last months, more than 3,000 dope tests have been conducted among the Russian athletes, and most of them have been negative, meaning that we're not having here a mass-scale use of dope. Second, it has been said that the work done by Professor Richard McLaren will be continued to finalize it. As he said it personally, he only skimmed the surface. Now, talking about the prestige, well, maybe that was exactly what the whole thing was about. It's just about mixing politics and sports. It's of the same kind as, for instance, the economic and financial sanctions used against Russia in order to contain its development. This is more or less the same. And this is just exactly what the Russian public is treating it. They're saying that the International Athletic Federation is using political tools in order to pressure Russia, not exactly name and punish the athletes who actually have been
But could the Russians have used political tools? Right, but
using
Vladimir,
the principle of collective responsibility.
Could the Russians have used political tools
Yes,
to
please.
pressure the IOC? There is somewhat of a close relationship between the Russians and the IOC.
Well, not that I know of. We are just one of many members of IOC, and what's more, if you just look at the representation of Russian citizens in all the major sports associations and federations, it has become really minuscule. The opinion of Russia at this level, among the so-called, at the level of Olympic bureaucratic institutions, is not heard as it should be, because, like it or not, given our credentials and past history, Russia is a sport superpower, like it or not. Judging by the mere number of sportsmen and sportswomen that have won Olympic Games throughout the last 60 or even more years.
Let's now bring in John Goodbody. He's joining us from London. He's a freelance sports reporter for the Sunday Times. To first get your initial thoughts on this decision by the IOC deciding against a complete ban on Russian athletes in the Rio Olympics.
Well, I've been covering the Olympics for nearly 50 years, and I would say that this is the most deplorable decision probably that the IOC Executive Board has ever taken. This was a moment for the IOC, who themselves set up WADA in 1999. I was there and in fact made a speech at the conference in 1999 in Lausanne, that the IOC set up the WADA with the obvious intention of having an independent body. The independent body have made their recommendation to the International Olympic Committee, and the International Olympic Committee has turned it down. And I just feel like a lot of people in the United Kingdom, and as far as I can judge, in many other countries in the world, that this is an example where the IOC has failed the athletes, has failed the competitors who are going to be competing at the Olympic Games in Rio.
But there is the idea as well, John, that Russia has been singled out right from the very beginning when it came to this investigation, and officials, Russian officials, now saying that even though we know dozens of athletes from well-known countries who will compete at Rio with just such a history, Russia is being singled out. You don't agree with that?
No, not necessarily, because of course the difference is that with Russia there has been a state-organized level of corruption, particularly at the Olympic Games themselves, the Winter Games in Sochi, which Russia, of course, were the hosts. And that is why it should be made, the IOC should have made a strong stance on this, which they have failed to do.
Vladimir, you were shaking your head at what John was saying out of London. Would you like to respond?
Definitely. I believe that it's really a very deplorable decision because it actually contravenes one of the basic legal principles. The first one, the statement made by the IOC reads that other athletes, even clean athletes, now have to assume collective responsibility. Collective responsibility or collective guilt actually rings a bell, a very nasty bell, because throughout the history it has been practiced by many totalitarian states. And second, it says that now the presumption of innocence is not applicable, meaning that even clean athletes now have to prove that they are clean. If you obliterate these two basic legal principles, then I believe that the IOC and in general the Olympic movement might now become very divisive and might even now slide into lawlessness. And then again, it reminds me of 1980, 1984, the former Olympics in Moscow and in Los Angeles. If we go this way, it will end up in tit for tat. It will actually have the political overtones of another Cold War conducted in the domain of sports. I believe this is very deplorable, and I believe that IOC has set a very dangerous precedent.
Aurel, go ahead in Toronto. I see you want to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I think our friend in Moscow is being extraordinarily disingenuous, and it is very much reminiscent of the language of the Cold War, where Russia was encircled, Russia was the victim. The only victims here are people who believe that sports were clean. What Russia has been found to have been doing is to systematically undermine what is so important in sports, and that is honesty. And consequently, if innocent Russian athletes have anyone to blame, it is the Russian government, which became involved in the systematic cheating. Now, in terms of law, Professor McLaren is a professor of law. Dick Pound is a lawyer. This is not collective punishment in the sense of some unfair measure. This is the same kind of thing that has happened before when measures were taken to have actions against South Africa, where the government behaved in an abominable way. This is a situation where the Russian government has played politics, and you notice how the discussion has shifted to a kind of political discussion because the Putin government has viewed sports as a continuation of politics in a very cynical fashion.
Well, let me ask you this then, since you mentioned politics, Aurel. For the United States, it seemed to be very important for them. I mean, they've now actually come out and criticized the IOC for taking that decision to not impose a blanket ban on Russia. Why, in your opinion, was it so important for the U.S. that this decision had gone through, whereas others hadn't in the past?
It's important for all states. And as I noted earlier, this was not an ideal decision by any means by the IOC. I don't think it was quite as bad as a decision as my London colleague is saying, because Russia has suffered a grievous blow. The credibility of Russian sports has been very badly damaged by the actions of Russia, and that any Russian athletes who will participate right now, who even pass some sort of test, will not be viewed as clean. Russia will not be taking back a huge haul of medals. Russia, which had invested such vast sums of money. I mean, think of Sochi. Russia is a relatively poor country. The per capita GDP of Russia is roughly that of Barbados. They spent more on the Sochi Olympics than any other country in history. And there is massive evidence of systematic doping. This was winning medals through chemistry, not through purely athletic efforts. And to be sure, Russia is not the first and not the only country to have cheated, but it did so on such a massive scale that we have hardly seen this since the case of East Germany.
Well, let me ask John in London, do you think that this means that the attention could possibly now turn to other countries, John?
Up to a point, yes. I mean, the real problem here has been, Russia, but clearly, no one would pretend that there are not severe problems in other countries. I mean, Kenya is one country of which there are problems. Turkey is another country, but it's not quite to the same extent that we've seen in Russia. But I'd like to just pick up briefly, if I may, on the point that Aurel's just made when he referred back to South Africa. One of the claims that the Russians have made recently is that by having a blanket ban on their competitors, and certainly a ban which is occurring in athletics, is that you are harming the innocent people in Russia. What you must remember is that between 1964 and 1988, black South African athletes were not able to compete at the Olympic Games because of the actions of their government, who insisted on having the apartheid policy. They were completely innocent, those black South Africans. They could have been competing in the Olympics, but they were not allowed to because of the actions of their government.
Vladimir, could this be a turning point for the Russians? Could they look towards solving this doping problem that's going on?
Well, to begin with, the decision has been taken at the highest level to actually reform the whole system of anti-doping testing. A special independent commission has been set up, or is in the process of being set up, to scrupulously examine what actually has been happening, and also to scrupulously examine what has been said by my opponents as a vast data of vast evidence that has been a mass-scale and state-sponsored doping program. So it will be all investigated, and probably will come with some facts and figures that actually might determine to a great extent what would be the policy of both. Definitely, since it has become a political issue, as once again my opponents have mentioned, it will be determined by the policy of the government and of the sports authorities in Russia. And depending on the outcome of this investigation, I might believe that in some cases there might be a boomerang effect, and maybe when there will be international sports competitions, sport contests, championships, cups held in Russia, for instance, the foreign athletes from countries that Russia would consider to be very dubious, or have been caught, some of them have been caught using drugs, illicit drugs, they might have to prove that they are innocent, that they are not guilty, that they are clean, and that are not. And only after that they would be allowed to participate in international sports competitions held in Russia.
John, what do you think of the upcoming reforms, if we may call them that? I mean, do you think that this could be a turning point for the Russians after this whole sort of debacle?
I think it could be a turning point, but it's a matter of whether the Russian authorities are genuinely sincere in carrying out the reforms which are clearly needed from top to bottom in Russian sport across, what has now become quite clear, not that one didn't suspect it beforehand, across a wide number of other sports. And that is what the Russians have got to do, is they've got to realise that they need to have a reform which is absolutely widespread and is sincere. And I suspect that it'll take some time before that will occur.
Aurel, yes, go on.
I'm rather skeptical of this because when I listen to my Russian colleague and he talks about Western plots and tries to discredit people like Richard McLaren, who has a sterling record, and Dick Pound and others, that there is going to be a genuine effort in Russia. I mean, we need to recognize, and the Russian government needs to recognize, that they should get legitimacy through means other than using sports. Every country takes pride in winning medals, but it's something else to do it as a means of trying to rally political support, to invest so much in sports to the detriment of other things. Russia could have spent much better the money that it expended in Sochi on desperately needed schools, on hospitals, where the medical care in Russia is in a very bad state. It could have spent that money on helping pensioners who are suffering. Russia could not waste, should not be wasting as much money on state-supported sports. I think the reform will be not just cleaner athletes, but to de-emphasize the political importance of sports. So Russia needs to depoliticize sports. And I think other countries might need to do that as well, whether it's China or some others, because one of the things that we saw with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe was this de-emphasizing in many countries of sports as politics. So we don't see the Bulgarians winning the kind of medals they did before, or the Poles or the Hungarians, because they invest far more money in social goods.
Okay, let me just allow Vladimir some time to answer to what Aurel had to say. Vladimir, go ahead.
Well, to begin with, I'm really amazed, and really very much amazed by the insistence that there is massive evidence of doping. Once again, there is hardcore proof that in the last months, I will repeat that, let me reiterate that, more than 3,000 doping tests have been taken. And only few of them, some of them, let's put it that way, were proved to be positive. So we're not talking about a mass use of dope. Second, according to the report
does talk about state-sponsored dope.
The Russian Olympic Committee has
the
not
report
been...
does talk about state-sponsored doping.
Once again, this hasn't been proved by any, well, I haven't seen any real proof and evidence that this is the case. And once again, in the McLaren report, it has been stated that the Russian Olympic Committee, that is something that my opponent was saying about reform from top to the bottom. The Russian Olympic Committee was not found guilty of any wrongdoings, ROC as an institution. This has been proved by what it is called independent person, meaning Professor McLaren. So what it actually is being what I see here is an attempt definitely to politicize this whole case. This attempt to politicize the case of doping and to include, trying an attempt to include the Russian government claiming that there's a state-run, state-sponsored affair.
Okay.
Which once again, I haven't seen any hardcore proof.
Okay, on that note, I'll have to leave it there.
I will return this argument. Depoliticize sports, please.
On that note, we'll leave it there. Thanks to all my guests, Vladimir, Mikheev, John Goodbody, and Aurel Braun. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha. Goodbye for now.